Hi, I'm Sebastian. Welcome back to another Photobook video. So today I'd like to do something a little bit different than what we've been doing on the channel so far. It's going to be somewhat more technical, but I still think really interesting. I want to talk about the anatomy of a photo book. And what I mean by that is essentially a breakdown of all the physical elements that go into the object of the book. So we'll start by looking at a single book and identifying all the features, learning the terminology. And then I want to talk a bit more in depth about signatures and binding and how photo books are actually constructed. And then we'll talk just briefly about covers and about paper and end with a discussion of printing and ink and photographic reproduction onto paper. So what do I want to achieve in this video? First of all, for anyone who's getting interested enough in photo books that you're watching a channel like mine, you're going to hear a lot of terms get thrown around. Things like end paper or book cloth, which I've already used in the videos that I've made so far. So I want anyone who's watching one of my videos and anyone who's just getting interested in this to have a baseline understanding of those terms and what they mean and what they look like. I think as a viewer of photo books, as someone who's looking at books, you know, in a good photo book, there's going to be a strong relationship between the work that's contained in it and the physical object. And so understanding these elements, understanding a bit about the choices that the artist made, I think can only deepen your appreciation of a book that you're looking at. And I think similarly as a practitioner, if you're an artist, a photographer, you're thinking about making a publication, whether it's a small zine or you're working with a printer or a bookbinder, again, understanding the terminology, being able to communicate it, knowing, examples of what other people have done, I think can only help you, express your vision if you're making a book. And then just looking around on the internet, I couldn't find a source of all of this information put together as it pertains to the photo book specifically. There's definitely information on bookbinding, there's some information on printing, but not really one place where someone talks about it specifically related to the photo book. So I thought it would be nice to have that for people who are getting interested in this. Just a few caveats before I get started. These are huge areas of knowledge, particularly bookbinding and printing. We're only going to be scratching the surface. I'm still learning these things myself, and so if you see something that I could have explained better or you have something to add or correct, please comment and add to the discussion. So let's get started by looking at a book. I picked this book out. This is Dear Clark by Sara-Lena Maierhofer, and I picked it because I like the work. It's a nice size to look at, and it contains a lot of the elements that we're going to see and talk about in many of the other books today. So let's switch to the overhead view and get started looking at some books. So once again, this is Dear Clark by Sara-Lena Maierhofer. And the first thing you see when you look at the book, of course, is the front cover. So this is also called the front board. And there's a front board and a back board. Typically, in a hardcover book like this, those are going to be made of a thicker cardboard that's pretty rigid. And then made of the same material, there's also the spine of the book, which is over here. All three of those are covered in the book cloth. So in a lot of photo books, that'll be this kind of linen type of cloth, but sometimes you'll see paper or leather or partly leather and book cloth. And then in between the front and back boards and the spine are the joints or hinges that actually allow the cover to bend away from the book. Just sticking on the outside for a second, the edges of the book. So besides the spine, you have the head up here for obvious reasons, and then the tail on the bottom, and then this is called the foredge. Opening up the book, the first thing you encounter are the end papers. So this is usually a different type of paper to the main part of the book, and it's attached to the inside of the cover, and then there's this free page, and then you go into the actual paper of the book. So you can see here how it's a different color than the white paper of the book. Often this will be kind of decorative. It might even be a bright color or like marbled paper, something like that. The part that is glued to the inside of the cover is called the paste down, and then this is called the fly leaf. And then speaking of leaves, each page is called a leaf as well. And with each leaf, you have the recto, which is on the right side facing you when you open the book up. And then you have the verso, which is on the left as you flip the page. So then in between the recto and verso, you have the gutter. So this is where the pages plunge in towards the center and are joined to the spine. And as you can see here, the gutter can kind of be a little bit of a controversial issue in photo books specifically because if you choose to print an image across the gutter, exactly where that gutter falls can affect how the image is read and interpreted. And then a couple of specific pages or leaves that we should mention. In the front we have, of course, the title page here, and then usually in the back of the book is the colophon, which is kind of like an information page. It usually contains publishing information, it might have the ISBN, credits, acknowledgments, the date of publication, that kind of thing. So that's your colophon. And that's it for the basic anatomy. Those are all the parts that you're going to find in almost any hardcover photo book that you encounter. All right, so now that we know all the parts of a book, let's talk a bit more in depth about how books are actually put together. So we're going to talk about folios and signatures and the different types of binding that you're going to commonly see. So let's take a look. Okay, so the basic building block of a book is called a signature. And all signatures is just a folded piece of paper. So this is the most basic type of signature, which is called a folio. All a folio is a piece of paper that I took and folded in half once. And you end up with this signature that has 2 leaves and 4 sides. And you could easily construct a book just from these. You could put one inside the other and make a book that way. And we're going to look at a couple of examples of exactly that in a moment. But once you get to a certain number of pages, that gets unwieldy. And so for most books, you're going to go up in the number of folds. So the next step up is called a quarto. A quarto is just a folio that's been folded in half another time. So we start with our full sheet of paper, we fold it in half once, that's a folio, and then we fold in half a second time to get a quarto. And it's called a quarto because it has 4 leaves, and thus it ends up with 8 sides, which I've numbered here. And what's interesting about that is when you unfold it, the layout of those numbers is kind of not intuitive. So you have 4 and 5 here, 1 and 8 over here, and then on the inside 2 and 7, and 6 and 3. And if you ever see, let's say, a photographer who's on press with a printer and you see the big signatures, because of course in a full-size photo book, these signatures, these pieces of paper are much larger, the photos are going to be arranged in this way. Or even more complicated when you get up to an octavo. So an octavo is another type of signature, and all this is a quarto that's been folded in half again. So we're going to unfold it completely. So we have our single piece of paper here. We fold it in half once to get a folio, we fold in half a second time to get a quarto, and we fold in half a third time to get an octavo. At this size, it's kind of hard to really deal with, but if you have a huge piece of paper like you're doing for a full-size photo book, it's easier to make those folds. There's one other thing that you have to do with the quarto and the octavo in order to make them a functional book, which is you have to trim them because there's leaves here that don't open. So we're going to cut, this is the spine side where it's all folded, so we're going to cut and trim the foredge, and then I'm going to trim the head of the book. And now, get rid of those, we actually have a functional octavo. It's an octavo because it has 8 leaves, 16 sides, and actually this is a pretty common type of signature that you're going to see in real full-size photo books. So now let's look at some real-life examples of how those signatures are actually put together into a book. And we'll start with the 2 most common types of binding in most photo books. This is TTP by Hayahisa Tomiyasu, and this is a great example of a perfect bound book. So in a perfect bound book, those signatures or individual sheets are gathered together, and they're just glued at the spine. So let's take a look and see if we can see that. So you can see it's really tight. There's not space between the signatures. There's really no space in between the book block and the spine because it's all just glued in there. This is a really practical way to put a book together. It's inexpensive and relatively simple to manufacture. The main disadvantage with something like this is that over time, especially if the book is read often, if you open it up completely wide, you're going to get creases in here, and eventually that glue might break down, pages and signatures might fall out. But other than that, it's a really great way to bind a book, and very common, especially in paperback books. So the other most common way to bind a photo book is what's called Smyth sewn, that's Smyth with a Y, or section sewn. Both refer to the same thing. And this is the more traditional and kind of more fancy way to bind a book. And what this involves is those signatures that we saw, like the octavos or quartos, that are bundled together and then actually sewn together at the spine with thread. And the way that you can tell something like this is of course photographs by Gabriel Orozco, is by looking at the head of the book and at the spine. So we'll take a look. So if you look at the edge here at the spine, you can actually see the signatures. You see that there's groups of paper bundled together, and then in between each there's like a tiny little bit of space, and they kind of like splay or curve out. So those are individual signatures, and I counted, each one has 8 leaves in this book, so those are octavos that are folded and then sewn together, and then the book is trimmed. And this is really the most common type of binding you're going to see for like a nice hardcover book. The other way that you can tell is by looking at the spine when you open the book. So when you open the book, you can see that there's space in between the spine and the book block, because the book block is all bound together with thread, and then it's just attached at the front and back cover, but not attached to the spine. So actually, because of that, a Smyth sewn or section sewn book will open relatively flat. Not completely flat, there's obviously still a gutter, but because the book block is not actually attached to the spine, it allows it to open a little bit more freely. I have another interesting example. This is Whispering Hope by Chikara Umihara. And what's cool about this book, this has a front and back board, but it actually doesn't have a cardboard exterior spine. So you get to see the binding directly. You see the individual signatures here, and you see the thread that binds them together at the spine. What's cool about this design is that it actually opens extremely flat. So in this case, you have an image that is going across the gutter, but the gutter, while still visible, it has a pretty minimal effect on the image because without that spine there, the book opens completely. So a very cool design and a nice glimpse into how a Smyth sewn book is actually constructed. So now that we've looked at the most common types you're going to see for most professional photo books, there are a bunch of other ways that you can bind a book that you'll see a lot of times in smaller publications and zines and that kind of thing. So this is Mother of Dogs by Matthew Genitempo, and this is interesting because this is a book that actually is not bound at all. This is a bunch of folios that are just put together one inside the other. I'm going to unfold it here to the center. So this is the middle folio, and I can just take this out of the book. There's this tape here to kind of give it a little bit of structure, but there's nothing actually attaching this folio to the next folio to the next folio. If you wanted, you could completely resequence this book. The other interesting thing about this is that it's not trimmed at the edge. So, of course, as the folios add thickness at the spine, the foredge of each folio gets further and further out, and so you get this really interesting kind of like tapered edge to the book. But here it is, a completely unbound book that's just a selection of folios put together. So the next step up from just a stack of folios that isn't bound at all is this, which you'll see in a lot of zines, which is called a saddle stitch, and it's done with staples. This is While We're Here by Myles, and here it still is a bunch of folios. There's a slightly thicker paper that's used for the cover, but if you unfold this to the middle, you'll see these staples in the gutter. So all this is a stack of sheets with the cover on the outside, placed flat like this, and then stapled in from the edge. So this is called a saddle stitch. Here's another example. This is A Rock That Floats by Irina Rozovsky. Same thing, open it up to the center, and you can see the staples right in here. It's just laid flat like this and stapled. It's a really simple, understated way of binding a small zine, but it keeps it together. It makes it a little bit more structured than just having the folios one inside the other. So besides staples, another common way that you're going to see smaller publications put together is by being sewn. And here's a few examples. So this is Stasis by Eich, and this is an example of a pamphlet binding or pamphlet stitch. And it's a similar concept to the saddle stitch. You have a bunch of folios that are opened up and laid flat like this, but instead of the staples here, you have holes that are punched through the spine, and then this string that's threaded through them and tied off here. So kind of a little bit more of a handmade feel with a pamphlet stitch. And then there's also what's called a Singer sewn binding. So Singer, like the sewing machine company. This is Speak Your Piece by Stacy Kranitz, and we'll take this outer cover off here. So in a Singer sewn binding, instead of those larger holes spaced further apart, this is done with a machine. The holes are smaller and tighter, and the thread is stitched more tightly, but still has kind of a nice handmade object sort of feel. And if you open it up in the middle, same thing. It's a bunch of folios that are laid flat, and you can see the thread going through the middle there. And actually with Singer sewn, you can make quite a large and nice publication. This is Width and 4 by Sophie Joseph Schwartz and Rochelle Marie Adam. And it's a pretty big size, but it's still the same thing. It's Singer sewn in a similar way. And if you open it up in the center, you're going to see the thread going through the gutter in that center spread. And then one more that you're going to see occasionally. This is Blood is on the Rails by Brian Van Lau. And this is a Japanese style side stab binding. So in this case, instead of folios that are opened up and sewn through, these are just individual sheets. So there's a front and back cover and then individual pages, and the holes are punched through the front and back like this and then stitched through there with the thread going along the spine. So also really nice sort of handmade feel to this that's different than the pamphlet and the Singer sewn. And lastly, before we get off the topic of binding, here's just a few less common variations that I think are still important to know. This is The Lonely Ones by Gus Powell, and this is bound in a normal way. This is Smyth sewn, but what's interesting about this book is that every page is actually a gatefold. So a gatefold is when you have a page that opens up like this. Sometimes you'll see them on both sides, but instead of just a traditional signature, I'm sure this is like kind of complicated to make, you have each recto that actually opens up into a gatefold where there's text on this side and then double spread image when you open it up. It's kind of interesting. So this is The Sleepers by Sophie Calle, and this is an example of a Swiss binding. So in a Swiss binding, the spine piece is only attached on one side, usually in the back, to the book block. So you still have an end paper here, but instead of the end paper with a fly leaf being attached to the front of the book block, this is actually open and loose and it's only attached on one side. You could also have it only attached to the front and loose in the back. And this allows you to open the book a little bit more flat than you would otherwise. Not a super common type of binding, but you'll see it occasionally. Up next is an accordion fold, or leporello, or sometimes you'll hear concertina. They all refer, I'm pretty sure, to the same thing. And that's a book that's bound where all of the pages are connected. So this is This Train by Justine Kurland. And when you open it up, it has two covers on the inside here. But when you open it up, what you find is that you start with the first page, and then the pages are actually attached to each other, so it becomes one continuous string of sheets going from the front to the back of the book. And it's printed on both sides. There's text here, and then the pictures start on the back as well. So you could take this whole book and unfold it and lay it out on the floor and look at all the images, at least on one side of the paper, all together. Again, not super common, but you will see it occasionally, and it's a really interesting way to bind a book. And then besides thread or glue, another way that you can put a book together is you can just screw it together. So this is Spell, Time, Practice, American Body by RaMell Ross. And this book is just put together with these rivets. So this actually does not have any signatures or folios. This is just a stack of individual sheets that are punched through here, and then these rivets hold it together. Something you'll see every once in a while. Another common example of this that people might know is American Monuments by Lee Friedlander. And then lastly, the good old spiral binding. This is Dandelion by Seth Lower. And what's interesting about this, usually you'll see a spiral binding, like a plastic spiral in a zine, and something that's like much smaller scale. This is a huge thing. I mean, this looks like a company's quarterly report or something like that. But another really interesting way to bind a book, and this book is beautifully printed, but this binding kind of gives it a casual sort of feel, or just an informal feel. And it also allows you to open it completely, although you can't really have a picture across the gutter because there's so much space. Anyway, spiral binding. All right, so now that we're familiar with the book block and the actual contents of the book, let's take a closer look at the first part of the book you might encounter, which is the cover. All right, so this is a book that's pretty special to me. Of course, this is my book, Oasis, that I made for my MFA thesis a couple of years ago with a cover design by Alana Schlenker. And I'm including this mainly because I have some of the stuff that went into making the cover, specifically related to the book cloth and the foil stamp. So in terms of the book cloth, we went with this kind of vibrant blue color, but we were considering a charcoal gray. And so I have some examples of what book cloth actually looks like when it's not on a book from the samples that I was sent. So you can see it's this thin, kind of like linen-y, but pretty tough material. And the blue was a similar type of material to these. And then let's talk about the foil stamp. So what's happening here with a foil stamp is that you have a metal die that's pressed into the cover, creating this like debossed area that's slightly below the surface. And there's a thin foil that's colored. It could be metallic, but could be a solid color like this. That's placed between the die and it's actually pressed into the cover. And it could be text like this. It could be a graphic, which I'll show you in a second. And here actually are what the dies look like. So this is a metal die, and this is what's pressed in. They actually colored the back with the, I guess, the color that we used. That's pressed into the book to create that foil stamp. And I'll show you the back. So on the back, we actually pulled this palm tree from one of the images in the book, and Alana turned it into a graphic. And so I actually have a foil stamp of that broken palm tree. But foil stamps like this are a really common design element that you're going to see on a lot of book covers. All right, so just a few more books that I want to look at with some examples of a lot of the common elements that you're going to see on photo book covers. This is Street Portraits by Dawood Bey. This also has a foil stamp of text in black, but the main element that I wanted to highlight here is the picture. So this is called a tipped-on image or a tipped-on picture. This is a photo that's printed onto paper, and then there's kind of like a debossed recess, and it's glued to the cover. You see this really often on modern photo books. This book actually has one on the front and the back. There you have tipped-on image. This is, of course, Lots by Tim Davis. And this is an example of a cover style that's kind of gone a little bit out of fashion, but is still interesting, and you'll still see it when you look at older photo books. This is about 20 years ago, mid-2000s. And this is basically a laminated cover. So instead of a book cloth, this is actually paper with some kind of plastic lamination over it. And then what that allows you to do is actually print not just text, but an image around the book. So another element that seems to have kind of gone out of style in photo books, but you'll run into occasionally, especially if you look at older books. This is, of course, I'll Be Your Mirror by Nan Goldin, I think from the 90s, is a dust jacket. And a dust jacket is exactly what it sounds like. This book is bound hardcover with cloth, just like any other book, but the dust jacket is a protective layer. When books are sitting on the shelf for a long time, that cloth is going to get a lot of dust in it. This is a way to prevent it. Some people make their own dust jackets out of clear plastic, but again, something you don't see that often anymore, but is very common in photo books that are slightly older. So then the last variation that I wanted to show was what's called quarter binding. And in the old days, this would have been done more like structurally for strength, but basically when you have the part of the book closest to the spine that's covered or bound in a different material, traditionally leather, and then the cloth is restricted to the parts of the book that are closer to the foredge. This is, of course, Morals of Vision by William Eggleston, and this is meant to look like a big, old portfolio, so it's just done kind of more in a decorative way. This book also has really beautiful marbled end paper that's pretty stunning. All right, so going back inside the book, another really important thing to consider is the paper. Of course, books are ultimately made of paper, and there's a lot of different variations and elements with the paper that are important when you're looking at photo books. So let's take a look. So one main variation with paper in different photo books is going to be the paper thickness. And maybe counterintuitively, the paper thickness is measured actually not in a distance, but as weight, because I guess it would be tough to measure the actual thickness of paper in a precise way. So instead it's measured by weight. You have a unit called grams per square meter, or GSM, and that's basically if you take a square meter of a given paper stock, however many grams that weighs, that's your GSM. A normal GSM value for most papers you're going to see in photo books might range anywhere from like 50 or so to about 150, 200 for real heavy papers. And what's interesting is that the GSM, or the paper weight, really changes the feel of a book. So I have two examples here. This is Nice by Mark Pekmezian, and this is a book printed with a very light paper. I don't know exactly what the GSM is. It might be tough to show it on camera, but I'll start flipping through. And even just by the sound, you might be able to tell that this is made from like a very thin, glossy sort of paper, kind of like a magazine. And the way that you can tell for sure that the paper is very thin is if you look at the spine of the book, it's not a particularly thick book, and yet we go to the end here and there's like 220 pages. So clearly quite a thin paper, and it gives it a certain feel. And on the other end of the spectrum is a book like this. This is American Scene by Sage Sawyer, and this is printed on a very thick heavy paper. So I'll try to open this up. Again, it might be hard to actually get this to show up or get a feel for it on camera. And if you ever have a chance to see this book in person, I would highly recommend it. But this is like a really thick, heavy, luxurious sort of paper. And again, so now this book, which is about the same thickness, only has 61 pages. And it changes the feel. It changes the interpretation of the images being on this heavier paper and also at this scale. All right, so besides paper weight or thickness, another way that photo book papers are going to be differentiated is the coating, whether they're coated or uncoated. And what that refers to, it's basically like a clay that's applied to the paper during the manufacture process of the paper, not during printing. And it kind of seals the surface of the paper, it restricts how much ink can go into it, and it leads to like a glossier surface of the paper than an uncoated paper, which is more of a matte finish. So here I have Robert Adams, the original Summer Nights from the 80s, and then Summer Nights Walking that was published from the same body of work a few years ago. And this is a really interesting comparison because this original Summer Nights, the paper is coated, and in Summer Nights Walking, the paper is uncoated. So we can look at the same images and see how they compare. So let's look at this picture, which is one of my favorites in the book. So this is the original 80s version with coated paper. I'm going to try to see if we can catch the light. So you can see that the whole paper, not just the picture, is this shiny kind of finish. It's glossier. You have these sort of like deeper blacks. When you touch the paper, it's smooth. There's not really much of a texture to it. This is the same image printed on uncoated paper, of course, slightly different size. I'm going to try to see if we can catch the light here. Yeah, so you can see that the paper is much more matte. It's barely catching the light. And it's a little bit lower contrast. It's maybe slightly less detailed, although that's compensated for by it being bigger. But it just has a different feel. And you look through this whole book in the old version and the new version, it actually changes the feel of the entire body of work, just that change between the coated paper and the uncoated paper. So in a similar vein to coated and uncoated paper, there's another variation to the paper finish that can be applied during the time of the actual printing, and that's called varnish, which is a coating that goes on at the same time as the ink and makes the paper or a part of the paper shinier and more glossy. It can be either a spot varnish, which just goes on the images, or a flood varnish that goes on the entire sheet. This is Dina Lawson's Aperture monograph, and this is just a nice example of a book that clearly has a spot varnish on the images. So I'm just going to open it up here. We'll try to see if we can catch it. But if I put this into the light, you can see, even though this is a coated paper and it's pretty smooth, the image itself is quite shiny and glossy, but the paper itself is less so. Just a way to add an accent to the image and make it a little bit glossier and sort of deeper and perhaps a little bit similar to a print. One other element with paper that I want to quickly mention is when you have a book that has different types of paper in it, and often that'll be a way to differentiate between different types of photographs or different parts of the book. This is called Blindest Man by Emily Graham, and so this has one type of paper, which is clearly a fairly thick coated paper for the main photographs. And then it has these archival images that are on a much thinner, uncoated sort of newsprint type of paper. And then sometimes you'll have that mixture of different types of paper for pictures and text. This is Encampment, Wyoming by Laura Webb Nichols. And here you have also a fairly heavy coated paper for the main photographs. And then for the text and some additional archival images in the back, you have this black paper, uncoated. And it's interesting too because it's black paper that's printed in silver. But sort of sets that part of the book apart. So it's an element you'll see every once in a while. All right, so now I want to talk a bit about printing and ink, the reproduction of photographs onto paper. So like I mentioned at the beginning of the video, this is a huge topic. I'm only going to scratch the surface, but I think there are a few basic concepts that are important to understand. And actually, if you're interested in this, there's an amazing series of video lectures by Richard Benson, who taught at Yale for many years, probably the world's expert on this topic. He had an exhibition of every type of photographic reproduction, from etchings all the way through modern digital reproduction at MoMA. This is probably about 15 years ago, and he gave a series of lectures where he really breaks it down in depth. So if you're more interested in this, I will link that in the description. All right, so the first concept I want to talk about with photographic reproduction is the idea of the halftone, because you're going to hear that term a lot. And the halftone is basically a way of taking continuous tones and breaking them up into discrete dots of information. So just sticking with black and white for a second, in printing you have this fundamental problem. You have black ink, you have white paper, but you have a photograph that has continuous gray tones in the middle. So how do you reproduce that? And the answer is the halftone. In the old days, a photograph would have been rephotographed through a grid and would have ended up on a copy negative with lots of tiny dots instead of the continuous tones. Now it's done digitally, but it's the same concept. And so in the halftone, areas that are dark gray, you have large dots, large black dots with very little white around them, and our brains at an appropriate distance perceive that as a dark gray. And then in lighter areas, you have very small dots with a lot of white around them, and again, at the right distance, our brains interpret that as a lighter gray. And so it's a way of basically reproducing a continuous tone or simulating a continuous tone through discrete dots of ink. In a way, it's kind of an analog to like motion pictures. In a film, you have a bunch of frames that are actually still images, but if you play them 24 frames a second or even a little bit slower, our brains interpret that as continuous motion. So similarly, at the right distance, our brains interpret the halftone as continuous gray tones. So for black and white, you have black and then the white paper. For color, it's broken up further. You have CMYK, which is cyan, magenta, yellow, and then K, which is the black channel. But again, all of those are just discrete dots of color, dots of ink in those colors that are printed onto the paper. So the other term that's worth understanding, because it's the way that pretty much all photo books you're going to look at these days are printed, is the idea of offset lithography. So in most photographic reproduction processes, you have some kind of plate, either metal or another material, that carries the ink, and then that's pressed into the paper to reproduce the image. And if you do it directly that way, that's called letterpress. That was the dominant method of printing before about the 1950s into the 1960s. In offset lithography, you add an intermediary, because the problem with letterpress is that paper is abrasive. And so if you make several thousand of those, the paper starts to wear away at the plate. In offset lithography, the plate transfers the image to an intermediary, which is typically a rubber blanket or roller, and then that puts the ink onto the paper. There are some other differences, but that's the main idea with offset lithography. And what that allows is much larger print runs. So pretty much all photo books that you're going to look at that are produced today are done with some variation of offset lithography. So now that we understand that, let's actually take a look at a few books and see the halftone and offset in action. All right, so starting in black and white, this is of course Southeast by Mark Steinmetz. And I picked a Mark Steinmetz book because his work is particularly known for these really rich open midtones with a lot of middle grays that I'm sure are very hard to reproduce in print. This was done by an Israeli press, and this book actually brings up another important variation. So just like in color, where you actually have 4 different inks that are going onto the paper, you can kind of do a similar thing in black and white. So you can have black and then 1 gray that goes onto the paper. That's called duotone. And then you can have what this book is, which is quad tone or quadratone, where you actually have black and then 3 separate shades of gray. But all of those inks are still printed on the book in a halftone pattern, making up the final image. So I picked this image because it's pretty much all medium grays, especially this really nice open shadow on her face and the shade of gray of the wall back here. But if you look at this up close, it still is all done via dots in a halftone type pattern. And you can do this at home yourself with a loop or with your phone or just looking at it really closely. From a normal distance, this looks like continuous grays like a darkroom print would, but when you see it like this up close, you see that it absolutely is just halftone dots, tricking the eye into seeing continuous gray. And then in color, you have a similar effect with CMYK, the halftone dot pattern tricking our eye into thinking that there's not just continuous tonality of light and dark, but continuous colors. This is Daddy, Where Are You by Tierney Gearin. And if we look at this image closely, zooming into this area, we see the same thing. If you look at the whole image, it looks like continuous tones, continuous color. but if you look at it up close, it is just a CMYK dot halftone pattern printed on the paper that's tricking our eye into seeing what we're seeing. So there's one other photographic reproduction process that I think it's worth knowing about, even though it's not practiced anymore today. But a lot of important photo books made in the 20th century use this process, and it's kind of romanticized and revered in the photography world. And that's photogravure, or just gravure printing. Gravure is fundamentally different than what we've talked about so far because it actually doesn't use the halftone, and it affords something that's closer to a continuous image. It's an intaglio process, meaning that you still have a metal plate, it's copper, and it's etched based on an image that's reproduced onto it, but instead of the ink being on the part that isn't etched away, in this case, the ink actually goes into the wells that are etched by the chemicals. And the depth of those wells is what determines the darkness, the thickness of the ink, and the darkness of the print. So basically you have areas that are etched very shallow, very lightly, that carry just a tiny film of ink, and then you have areas that are etched more deeply that carry deeper wells of ink, and that's what goes onto the paper. So you get something a lot closer to a continuous tone. You do not see the halftone dot pattern, and there's just something really beautiful about the look and the texture of a gravure printed book. I have a few gravure printed books, but one that I'd like to look at is by Joseph Sudek, so let's take a look. So this was printed in the mid-50s in gravure. And when you open a gravure book, you immediately notice that there's something different about it. It just has a different look and feel to a modern halftone printed photo book that's done with offset. Part of it is the paper. The paper has this real nice matte quality and this texture. And then the tonality of the black and white just comes across differently than in an offset printed book. It's really beautiful. I hope if you have a chance to take a look at a real gravure book, you do, because it's kind of hard to describe, and I'm sure it's not quite coming through in the video, but there's something really special about it. And let's do the same thing as we did with the other two books and take a look at this image more closely, specifically in the eye area, and you'll see that when you zoom in on this, there is no halftone dot pattern the way that you saw in the offset books. It is really closer to a continuous gray, and that just lends a whole different look and feel to a gravure book. So they're really special, and I'm glad that I have a couple of these. All right, so there you have it, the anatomy of the photo book. I hope that that was interesting and useful. I definitely enjoyed making this video. If you liked it, at some point I'd like to make a spin-off. You know, when I was pulling books, even though there are a lot of books in this video, I found many others that had some kind of interesting or less common combinations of features that we talked about, some things we didn't talk about. So at some point I'd like to do kind of like a lightning round where we just go through a bunch of them quickly and look at them. So if that interests you, stay tuned. Hopefully we'll do that in the next few months. As always, thank you so much for watching. Please like the video. Please subscribe to my channel if you enjoy what you're seeing. And as always, please comment. I love to have a discussion with anyone who's watching these videos. So, you know, if you found it useful, if there's something you want me to talk more about in a future video or expand upon, if there's anything you have to add or correction, like, please go ahead and comment. Anyway, thank you again, and I'll see you next time.